There is a moment most of us have experienced at least once in our lives. That electric, almost intoxicating feeling when a new idea strikes us, when a vision forms so clearly in our mind that we can almost reach out and touch it. Our heart beats a little faster. Our breathing changes. We feel as if we have just discovered something magnificent about ourselves and about our future, and almost immediately, like a reflex we cannot control, we want to tell someone. We want to share it. We want to witness someone else's eyes light up the way ours just did. It feels natural. It feels human. And in many ways, it is deeply human. But what if I told you that this very impulse, this beautiful, warm, generous urge to share your dreams the moment they are born, is quietly and consistently one of the most powerful forces working against your success? What if the thing that feels the most like connection is actually a form of self-sabotage so subtle that most people never recognize it until years, sometimes decades, have already passed them by? This is not a simple productivity tip. This is not about keeping secrets for the sake of mystery. What I want to walk you through today goes far deeper than that. This is about understanding how your brain actually works, how your psychology is shaped by ancient survival mechanisms that were never designed for the world of ambition and personal goals, and how, once you truly understand what is happening inside your mind, you will never again make the same mistake that has quietly stolen the futures of millions of gifted, intelligent, passionate people across every culture and every generation. Let us begin where all understanding must begin, with a story. Because stories are not entertainment. Stories are the oldest technology the human mind has for storing and transferring truth. And this particular truth needs to be felt before it can be understood. There was once a young man named Elias who grew up in a modest town where everyone knew everyone, where the streets were narrow and the gossip traveled faster than the wind. Elias was not ordinary. He had a quality that most people admired from a distance but rarely understood up close. He burned with ideas. From the time he was a boy, his mind was never quiet. He saw possibilities everywhere. In the empty lot on the corner of his street, he saw a marketplace. In the abandoned warehouse near the river, he saw a workshop. In himself, he saw someone destined for something larger than the life he had been handed. When Elias was 23, he had an idea that would change everything. He wanted to create a small business, a leather goods workshop, because he had spent 3 summers learning the craft from an old man in the neighboring town who had treated leather with the kind of patience and reverence usually reserved for prayer. Elias was genuinely skilled. His hands had learned what his mind already knew, and the combination was rare and powerful. The business idea was not a fantasy. It was grounded. It was achievable. All it needed was consistent effort over about 18 months. The morning after the idea fully crystallized in his mind, Elias walked into the small cafe where his friends gathered every day before work. He sat down, leaned forward, and began to speak. He spoke for almost 40 minutes. He described the workshop, the types of bags and belts he would make, the customers he would attract, the market he had identified, the old warehouse and how he would transform it, the name he had already chosen, the logo he had already sketched on a napkin. His friends were captivated. They asked questions. They offered suggestions. One friend told him it was the best idea he had ever heard. Another said he would be the first customer. A third said that Elias was born to do this, that he always knew Elias had something special inside him. Elias walked home that morning feeling extraordinary. He felt as if he had already built the workshop, already served his first 100 customers, already proven everyone who had ever doubted him completely wrong. That evening, instead of researching suppliers or drafting a simple business plan, he sat on his porch and basked in the memory of his friends' reactions. He replayed their words in his mind. He felt proud. He felt certain. He felt, in a word that is important to remember, satisfied. And that satisfaction, that warm, full feeling in his chest, was the beginning of his undoing. 3 weeks later, nothing had been done. Not a single concrete step. When a friend asked about the workshop, Elias said he was still planning. When another friend asked a month after that, Elias said he had run into some complications. By the 6th month, the topic had quietly died the way most topics do in small towns. It was replaced by someone else's announcement, someone else's dream being celebrated over coffee, someone else's future being applauded before it had taken a single breath. Elias tried 2 more times in the following years: a furniture restoration business, a photography studio. Each time the pattern was identical. The brilliant idea, the announcement, the applause, the satisfaction, the stillness, the silence, the shame. By the time Elias was 31, he had stopped sharing his ideas not because he had run out of them, but because he could no longer bear the look in people's eyes when they realized again that nothing had come of his words. He had become a man who people described with genuine affection and genuine sadness as someone with so much potential. There are few phrases in any language more heartbreaking than that one. So much potential. It is the eulogy of a life that was lived entirely in the mind, in conversation, in the beautiful warm space between an idea and its execution, where everything is still possible because nothing has yet been attempted. Now I want you to understand something crucial. Elias was not lazy. He was not lacking in talent. He was not cursed by bad luck or poor circumstances. Elias was, quite simply, a victim of a psychological mechanism that nobody had ever explained to him. A mechanism that operates in virtually every human brain, that is deeply wired into our neurology, and that has a name, a science, and a solution. Let us talk about what was actually happening inside Elias's mind every time he made an announcement. And to understand this, we need to go back much further than Elias. We need to go back approximately 200,000 years, to a world where human beings lived in small tribes of roughly 30 to 150 people. In that world, social reality and physical reality were almost the same thing. To be recognized by your tribe, to be seen as capable, as valuable as someone who contributed, was not merely pleasant. It was survival. A person who was admired and trusted by the group had access to food, to protection, to mates, to resources. A person who was cast out of the group died. It was that simple and that brutal. Now here is where it gets fascinating. The human brain, in order to motivate behavior that would lead to social recognition, evolved a system of internal rewards. When you did something that elevated your status in the eyes of others, your brain released dopamine, the molecule of anticipation and reward, along with serotonin, which regulates your sense of social standing and belonging. These chemicals did not wait for the outcome. They were released during the behaviors that typically led to good outcomes. This is important. Say it slowly in your mind. The chemicals were released during the behaviors, not just after the outcomes. This means that when ancient humans performed an action that signaled competence or ambition to the group, the brain began rewarding them immediately, as a kind of advance payment against the expected future success. This was an enormously useful system for most of human history. It kept people motivated through the long, unglamorous stretches of work that lay between intention and achievement. But then, something changed. Language evolved, and with language came something our ancient neurology was completely unprepared for: the ability to communicate intention without action, the ability to describe a future as if it were a present, the ability to perform competence through words rather than through deeds. Here is what happens in your brain when you announce a goal to people who respond positively. Your brain cannot fully distinguish between the social reward of doing something and the social reward of saying you are going to do something. When your friends at that cafe leaned forward and told Elias his idea was brilliant, his brain received a neurological signal that registered as partial goal completion. The praise activated the same reward circuits that actual achievement would have activated. The dopamine arrived. The serotonin rose. The feeling of satisfaction, of status, of being recognized and valued by the tribe flooded through him. And here is the critical point that changes everything. Once those reward circuits have been activated, once that neurological paycheck has been deposited, the motivation to continue working toward the goal drops. Not completely, not always permanently, but measurably, consistently, and powerfully enough to derail most people most of the time. This is what psychologists call social reality. When you share a goal and people affirm it, that goal begins to feel socially real. It has been witnessed. It has been validated. It exists in a world outside your own mind, and because it feels real, your brain begins to treat it as if some of the work has already been done. This was proven in a landmark study by the psychologist Peter Gallwitzer, a researcher at New York University, who has spent decades studying the relationship between intention, identity, and behavior. Gallwitzer and his colleagues ran a series of experiments in which participants who had set personal goals, related to things like studying law or pursuing fitness, were divided into two groups. One group shared their goals with others, who acknowledged and affirmed the intention. The other group kept their goals private. All participants were then given work to do that would move them toward their stated goals. But they were allowed to stop whenever they felt they had done enough. The results were striking. The people who had shared their goals and received social recognition quit working significantly sooner than those who had kept their goals private. And when asked how close they felt to achieving their goals, the sharers rated themselves as considerably closer, even though they had objectively done less work. Their feeling of progress was decoupled from their actual progress. The announcement had created a kind of psychological illusion of advancement that made continued effort feel less urgent, less necessary, almost unnecessary. Gallwitzer called this premature cognitive closure. The mind closes around a sense of completion before completion has actually arrived. The file drawer shuts, the chapter feels finished, and the energy that should have fueled weeks or months of disciplined, unglamorous work is simply gone, spent in the currency of words rather than in the currency of action. But there is another dimension to this that most people never consider, and it is in some ways even more damaging than premature cognitive closure. It is the burden of the audience. When you announce a goal publicly, you do not only change your internal psychology, you also change your external environment. You create observers, and observers change everything. Think about the last time someone was watching you do something you were trying to learn. Maybe you were learning to drive, or to cook a new dish, or to play an instrument, or to speak a new language. Were you better with the audience or worse? Most people are significantly worse. The presence of observers activates what psychologists call evaluation apprehension, a state of heightened self-consciousness and anxiety that consumes cognitive resources that would otherwise be devoted to the task itself. Your mental bandwidth, which is already limited and precious, is now partially consumed by monitoring yourself through the imagined eyes of others, by managing the performance of effort, by the exhausting work of being seen trying. For goals that require creativity, problem-solving, long-term learning, and the capacity to tolerate failure and frustration, evaluation apprehension is particularly destructive. These activities require what psychologists call a psychological safe space, an internal environment where mistakes are not threatening, where wrong turns are simply information, where the messy, non-linear, often humiliating process of genuine learning can unfold without the additional weight of an audience's judgment. When you announce your goals, you eliminate that safe space. Every stumble now has witnesses. Every setback is now a public event. Every moment of doubt is now visible. And for most people, the mind begins to protect itself from that exposure by simply reducing the amount of stumbling, which means reducing the amount of trying. This is why so many brilliant, ambitious people become paralyzed not by lack of talent but by the very act of being seen. The announcement that was meant to hold them accountable actually becomes a cage. The spotlight that was meant to motivate them actually blinds them. Now I want to introduce you to a concept that sits at the intersection of psychology and philosophy, one that I believe is among the most important ideas for understanding human potential. It is the concept of identity foreclosure. Our sense of who we are is not fixed. It is constantly being written and rewritten by our experiences, our choices, our relationships, and crucially by the stories we tell about ourselves. When you announce a goal, you are not merely describing an intention, you are making a claim about identity. When Elias said, "I am going to build a leather goods workshop," he was also saying, on a deeper level, "I am the kind of person who builds things. I am an entrepreneur. I am someone with vision and courage and follow-through." The people who affirmed his announcement were, in essence, confirming that identity. They were reflecting back to him a version of himself that he deeply wanted to be. Here is the psychological trap. Once an identity has been publicly claimed and socially confirmed, the mind begins to protect that identity rather than develop it, because developing it requires risk, requires failure, requires the uncomfortable, identity-threatening experience of not yet being what you have claimed to be. And the mind, which is fundamentally a risk management system, often finds it easier to protect the claimed identity through avoidance than to threaten it through action. In other words, if Elias never actually tries to build the workshop, he can never definitively fail. He can always exist in the comfortable liminal space of being someone who is about to do something great. The potential remains intact, the dream stays alive, and the identity of the person with the big idea is never truly tested and never truly at risk. This is what the psychologist Carol Dweck's research on fixed versus growth mindsets ultimately points toward, though from a slightly different angle. People with a fixed mindset, those who believe that talent and ability are innate and static, are particularly vulnerable to this form of identity protection. Because for them, attempting something and failing is not just a setback in a project. It is evidence about who they fundamentally are. It is a verdict on their worth, and so the announcement becomes a way of having the identity without incurring the risk. A kind of psychological insurance policy that lets them feel like the person they want to be without enduring the process of actually becoming that person. Let me now tell you about a different kind of person. Not a perfect person, not a person without fear or doubt or struggle, but a person who understood, either by wisdom or by hard experience, something essential about how dreams. Her name was Mara. She grew up in the same kind of town as Elias, knew the same kind of people, felt the same kind of longing for something more. But Mara had a habit that most people found slightly strange. When she had an idea, she went quiet. Not cold, not distant, just quiet in a particular way. Her close friends learned to recognize it. There was a quality of inward focus that came over her, a subtle turning of the attention, like a sunflower moving toward a light source that no one else could yet see. Mara had decided, after one painful early experience of announcing a dream and watching it dissolve in the warmth of other people's encouragement, that she would treat her ideas the way a farmer treats seeds in early winter. She would bury them. She would water them in private. She would not ask anyone to come look at the soil and admire the potential harvest. She would simply work, every day, a little, sometimes more. She would let the thing grow until it was strong enough to survive the exposure of being seen. It took her 2 years to build her first real project, a small community library in her neighborhood funded through a combination of her own savings. Quiet conversations with 3 trusted people who she knew would help rather than merely celebrate, and a grant she had researched and applied for without telling anyone until the money arrived. When she announced it, she did not announce a dream. She announced a library. It was already there. You could walk through its door. You could pull a book from its shelf. The announcement was not a declaration of intention. It was an invitation. The psychological difference between what Mara did and what Elias did is not small. It is enormous. And it is the difference between a life of rich, quiet accomplishment and a life of loud, painful incompletion. What Mara understood intuitively and what the science confirms is this: the intrinsic motivation that powers genuine long-term achievement is an extraordinarily delicate thing. It is not the robust, tireless engine we imagine it to be. It is more like a flame. It needs fuel. It needs oxygen. It needs to be protected from winds that are too strong, and social attention, especially premature social attention, is often exactly the kind of wind that extinguishes it. The psychologists Edward Desai and Richard Ryan, who developed what is known as self-determination theory, have spent decades studying the conditions under which human motivation thrives and the conditions under which it collapses. Their research consistently shows that intrinsic motivation, the deep, self-generated desire to pursue something because it is meaningful and satisfying in itself, is undermined by certain kinds of external pressure and external reward. When the external environment begins to feel controlling, when the sense of pursuing something for its own sake is replaced by the sense of pursuing it to satisfy someone else's expectations, to live up to a public identity, to avoid the shame of public failure, intrinsic motivation weakens. The activity that once felt like an expression of the self begins to feel like an obligation imposed from outside the self, and the person quite naturally begins to resist it. This is why accountability partnerships, which are enormously popular in productivity culture, often fail in the long run. The initial boost of external accountability can be genuinely useful for building early momentum. But if the accountability structure becomes the primary source of motivation, if the person is working to avoid disappointing their accountability partner rather than because the work itself calls to them, the behavior becomes fragile. It depends on the presence of the external structure to survive. Remove the partner, remove the audience, remove the external pressure, and the behavior collapses. Because it was never truly internalized. It was always, in a psychological sense, borrowed motivation. Genuine lasting achievement is powered by motivation that is owned, not borrowed. And that kind of motivation grows best in silence, in the private space between you and your work, where no one else's reaction can substitute for your own effort, where the only feedback that matters in the early stages is the feedback of the work itself. There is a practice that comes from this understanding, And it is simple enough to begin today. When an idea forms, when a goal crystallizes, when a vision appears, do not speak. Not yet. Instead, sit with it. Work with it. Let it move through the stages of development that require only you. Ask yourself before you tell anyone, what is the first concrete action I can take? Not the 100th, not the biggest. The first, the smallest possible step that would move the seed from idea to reality. And then take that step without an audience. This does not mean you must work in total isolation forever. There is a time to share, and there is a time for trusted collaboration, and there is a time to ask for help. But that time is not the moment of inspiration. That time is when you have something solid enough to withstand the weight of another person's gaze. When the roots have grown deep enough that the wind of their reaction, even if it is doubt, even if it is criticism, cannot uproot the plant. When you are sharing not to feel validated, but to genuinely invite contribution. The psychologist Teresa Amabile at Harvard Business School has studied the creative lives of professionals across many fields, and one of her most consistent findings is what she calls the progress principle. The single greatest source of motivation and emotional well-being during a long creative project is the experience of making tangible progress, no matter how small. Not recognition, not praise, not social affirmation, progress itself. The feeling of having moved, however slightly, from where you were to somewhere new. This feeling is self-generating. It creates its own momentum. Each small movement forward releases enough neurological reward to fuel the next small movement forward. But here is what is so critical. That chain of self-generated momentum can only begin if you actually take the first step. And the first step is infinitely harder to take if you have already received a neurological reward through announcement. The announcement short-circuits the chain before it even begins. It delivers the reward before the progress has been made, and in doing so, it removes the incentive for the progress itself. So what does the science say to do? Keep the dream quiet until the first steps have been taken. Use the energy of inspiration not to fuel conversation, but to fuel action. Find one thing, however small, that you can do in the next 24 hours that represents real, concrete movement toward your goal. Do it before you tell anyone. Then find the next thing, and the next. And when you have done enough work that the project has its own internal structure, its own momentum, its own existence independent of your intention, then if it serves the work, you can begin to share. Not to seek validation, not to feel important before you have done important things, but because the work is ready to meet the world and the world is ready to meet the work. I want to close with something that is less about strategy and more about spirit. Because all the psychology in the world is ultimately in service of something deeper. The question of what kind of life you want to live, what kind of relationship you want to have with your own potential. There is a kind of person who moves through the world loudly, who fills every room with announcements, who measures their worth by the size of their audience and the warmth of the applause. This person is not bad. They are not foolish. They are, in many cases, simply in pain. They are looking for reassurance that they are enough, that their dreams are worthy, that they are seen and valued by the people around them. And they are looking for it in the wrong place, because no amount of external affirmation can fill the space that only real accomplishment can occupy. The applause is loud, but it does not last. And in its silence, the hunger returns, stronger than before. And then there's another kind of person, quieter, less immediately impressive at parties. The kind of person who, when asked what they are working on, smiles slightly and says something like something I am not quite ready to talk about yet. This person has learned the deepest secret of productive life, which is that the work itself is the reward. That the slow, private, often invisible process of building something real is where the meaning lives. Not in the announcement, not in the applause, in the grain of the wood under your hands, in the page that slowly fills, in the conversation that moves the project 1 inch closer to completion, in the feeling late at night when everyone else is asleep of knowing that you did something today that you did not do yesterday. That feeling is yours. It belongs to no one else. It cannot be taken by doubt, cannot be deflated by skepticism, cannot be stolen by the indifference of an audience that has moved on to the next announcement. It is the most private and most durable form of wealth that a human being can accumulate, and it grows only in silence. So protect your seeds, bury them deep, water them faithfully. Tell no one which corner of the garden you have chosen. And when the tree is tall enough to cast a shadow, when the branches are strong enough to hold the weight of fruit, when the roots have gone so deep that nothing can pull them loose, then and only then invite the world to come and sit beneath it. They will not need you to describe what they can see with their own eyes. They will not need to imagine what they can already touch. And you will not need their admiration, because you will already have something worth far more. The quiet, unshakable knowledge that you built it yourself, one silent day at a time.